right, here we go. Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, and welcome to a special episode with a special guest. Joining me is author Tim Durling. We're going to be talking about Sammy Hagar, and we're going to be talking about his book about Sammy Hagar, Red on Black, a listener's guide to Sammy Hagar. Where Tim's also going to be, besides talking about Sammy Hagar, he's going to be sharing with us what he feels to be the essential Sammy solo albums and the solo albums from Sammy that you should avoid. Because maybe you're somebody like me where honestly, I'm not a huge Sammy Hagar fan. And I had no idea he had this many solo albums. That's what made reading this book so much fun. He's one of these guys that, besides the superficial stuff, yeah, he sang with Van Halen. He likes to dress in red. He fast cars, Cabo Wabo, all
Gila.
that kind of stuff. Besides all that essential stuff, I don't really know a lot about Sammy Hagar. So this was really fun reading this and reading about his history and sort of putting it all together in a timeline for us. So Tim, thanks for joining me here at the Lair.
Thanks for having me on, John. And yeah, man, that's you kind of summed it all up right there. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do this book because I think a lot of people don't realize how prolific Sammy has been all of his career. He's never taken that long in between something coming out with him on it, and he just kept doing it, whether they sold or not. He just kept pumping out the albums, and as recently as 2 years ago, Sammy Hagar and The Circle put out an album called Crazy Times. He's talking about new music with the lineup he's playing with now that did the Best of All Worlds tour and are doing the Vegas residency. He's talking about putting out new music with them. I'm looking forward to it. But yeah, I don't think a lot of people know just how many albums he's put out on his own. I think, most people know the albums he did in the 80s, but yeah, there's a lot there.
Tell us about the format of the book because I really enjoy this kind of format, this album by album. Just tell us about how you put the book together and the format.
This one's a little bit different because for the first time, I didn't do a panel discussion book, which I've done many times before. And because my last two books, my Y&T book and my Kansas book, were both panel discussion books, and I love doing those. And I'm actually working on another one. But for this Hagar one, there are a few reasons I struck out on my own and wrote the entire thing. One is I I don't think I could have filled a panel up with people to talk about each album for the reasons you just said. That some of his earliest albums and even some of his later albums, they're so obscure that only the diehard fans know them and can speak to them. So I thought, you know what? Let's do this. Yeah, I'll try this one myself. And I did have a lot of points I wanted to make. And one of the points I wanted to make was just how hard it was to find his early solo work back in the day, like in the late 80s when I first really started buying albums. His early material, because none of it was particularly successful. The stuff he did on Capitol Records were all but invisible. I never found them in stores anywhere. They were all out of print. This is pre-internet, so I had a hard time to find them. And I still remember the search and how fun it was when I actually did track something down. And then I also wanted to, yeah, I definitely wanted to go album by album and give each one of his solo albums a chapter. Now, I do a chapter at the beginning on Montrose, two records he did with them. And of course, I couldn't not talk about Van Halen. There's a chapter on Van Halen, and then there's a chapter on Chickenfoot. So all the band situations get their own chapter. But every album that basically has his name in it, whether it's Sammy Hagar and the Waburitas, Sammy Hagar and the Circle, even the Hagar, Sean Aronson, Shreve album, those all have their own chapter. And in each chapter, I list all the songs. I list the writing credits, who produced them, when it was released, and all of that. I talk about the cover art a little bit, and I kind of give a little review about what I think of the album. And I think people can get a feel, even if they don't agree with me, what kind of album I'm talking about. I hope so, anyway. And then at the end of each chapter, I have a section called covers/other recordings, because yeah, it's right there. In Sammy's earliest period, he did a lot of cover songs, whether they were forced on him by the record company or they were songs he liked, I don't know. But I wanted to find out where those songs came from, who else recorded them. And then there are cases where people recorded Sammy's songs and covered them. And I wanted to talk about those too. And so at the end of each chapter in the year that's appropriate, I talk about those other versions of the songs. That was one of the more fun parts of putting this together because I actually learned a lot in doing that. I even discovered a French version of one of his songs doing that.
Wow. So see if you can answer this for me because sometimes I wonder about things like this. Sammy is an amazing singer. He's a phenomenal singer. He's was in arguably one of the biggest rock bands of all time, Van Halen. He's had multi-platinum success. He's had videos, solo videos. I Can't Drive 55 was played like mad during the 80s. Again, Van Halen, super successful band. So why is it that Sammy is one of these guys where you just said, "Hey, I would have had trouble putting a panel together to talk about this guy." Why is it? It's I don't want to say he's obscure, but it's
No, but
almost like he is, especially his solo stuff. It's almost like he's the most popular obscure, singer out there. And why do you think that is?
I think it's because he's had such a long career, and very few artists are successful all the way through. And another comparison that I make, and I think it's a valid one, is Alice Cooper, because if you look at when Alice, from Alice starting in '69 with Pretty's for You till his Road album last year, if you look at the, flow chart of his album sales, those albums between 71 and 74 are all like platinum albums, right?
Hmm.
Welcome to My Nightmare. Then there's a long gap, and then there's Trash, and then there's nothing. So he's
Hmm.
got a lot of obscure albums, but everybody knows who Alice is, right? And with Sammy, he's not as popular. I don't think he's at that level of people would look at a picture of him and go, "Oh, that's Sammy Hagar," unless you're really into a particular time period in music. Um, with Van Halen, I think, obviously Sammy's, at the end of the day, he's going to be known for the guy that replaced David Lee Roth in Van Halen. And that's not a slight because Van Halen are one of very few bands that survived changing lead singers because usually that's it. Didn't work for Motley Crue. It
Hmm.
didn't, and on and on and on. Like bands change their singers. That's the identity of the band. It's the mouthpiece. It's the
Hmm.
the face of the band, usually the spokesperson. And David Lee Roth was so unique in so many ways that it's like, how could they possibly go on? And they did. Now, I think it's a completely different band. You know, stylistically, Eddie was writing in a different way. It was more melodic, and it was just so totally different than the first six albums. I think they're two great bands, but Van Halen are one of very few bands. AC/DC are about the only other band I can think of that replaced a singer and maintained and gained more success.
Hmm.
In the case of AC/DC, I don't think most people would begrudge a band for continuing when your singer dies, but you know what I mean? Like it's just very, very hard to replace the voice of the band. Um, but as far as his solo career, by the time that Sammy joined Van Halen, yeah, and a lot of people know I Can't Drive 55, but that was like his ninth album. He'd
Yeah.
been just hammering the albums out to little or no. He did the first five solo albums he did were on Capitol Records, and those all came out between 1976 and 1980. None of those albums certified. He had a couple songs hit the top 100. He had no big hit singles. It wasn't until he signed to Geffen Records in the early 80s and started releasing like Stanley Hampton and Free Lock Box when he started getting gold records and a couple platinum records and some singles that cracked the top 40. And then after Van Halen, by the time that his first post Van Halen album came out in 1997, Marching to Mars, it was a period where veteran rock musicians weren't selling albums anymore, for a number of reasons, whether it was Napster or whether it was just changing musical trends. And Sammy, unfortunately, wasn't one of those guys that could ride that out. He ended up doing a lot of albums for a lot of different labels, some major, some sort of mini major, some very minor. So the albums didn't get in stores like they used to. So, but I admire the guy because whether or not they make money for him or not, he keeps doing it. He does not need to keep putting out new music. And as a matter of fact, A lot of veteran groups don't. They just stop and all they do is tour and tour and tour and play the hits. And Sammy's never done that. And he's made himself a lot of money with his tequila, the
Yeah.
tequila company and selling it in Cabo Wabo. He's got his own sort of lifestyle brand. And some people, I think, know him in that capacity more than they know his music. So he's obviously making music because he wants to. He knows it won't sell. He knows he's not going to have gold and platinum albums, but he keeps doing it. And I admire that. And for the most part, I think what he's been doing is quite good. But you put all of that together and you've got a discography that's top heavy with obscure albums. That's how that happens. He'll always he'll always have press because people are always, I think, till the end of time, they're always going to ask him questions about Van Halen.
Yeah.
And that's why he takes so much crap because Sammy's saying this. Well, if people would quit asking him,
Yeah.
you're always going to ask him about Van Halen. In the latest round, they keep asking about Alex Van Halen and his book and
Yeah. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
really in it and all this. Well, but that's why I think it is. He's known as a personality, and people know his voice from Van Halen having those big hits with him on vocals. But yeah, to go through each of the albums, I don't think I could have found enough people to fill out a panel. So, but I'm glad. It turned out to be a pretty good exercise for me, and I think I grew. I'd like to think I got better at it. So, it came out. I'm quite happy with the way it came out, and I think I accomplished what I wanted to accomplish because I wanted to give, just like with the Kansas and Y&T books, I wanted to give the albums that sold 1 million copies the same amount of time and care that an album that didn't sell 40,000 copies. So that's
Yeah.
kind of what I did here.
Yeah, that's what I find interesting about books like this. I like the format because you go album by album, and so you can sort of jump around. I'm guilty of this when I grab books like this. I'll sort of jump around, and you can do that. But it's almost more interesting reading about the more obscure stuff. I did really enjoy. You had a section on truck stop tapes, and
I'm glad you
maybe you
like
could
that. Yeah.
comment on what truck stop
Yeah.
tapes are. And you're a good guy to do this because I know you have your 8-track book. What's the title of your 8-track book?
Unspooled.
Unspooled,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? 8-tracks are a pretty like 70s. I don't want to say obscure format, but they
It
just
had its
occupy.
it had its biggest, success in the 70s for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
these truck stop tape things, I sort of remember as you call them Kmart tapes. I don't know if you have Kmart up where you were. Kmart was
Yeah.
like a
Yeah.
early sort of version of Walmart, a discount
Mhm.
sort of chain store.
Department
And so
stores.
go ahead and tell people what
I'm
truck stop tapes
I'm
are.
I'm really glad you like that. I really wanted to put that in because that's kind of how my Sammy Hagar collection started. And maybe it's old terminology, but I know there's a lot of older guys that know exactly what I'm talking about. But there were also truck stop CDs, and what these are, they are they're not bootlegs and they're not counterfeits. They're legitimately released through a record label, but oftentimes without any involvement from the artist. So usually what will happen is an artist will be on a label and they'll leave the label, go to another label and start having more success. It happens all the time. Um, and what the former label will do, unless the artist has it in their contract that they can't do it, is that I got a sneeze coming on here. Hold on. I was trying to fight it off. Um, what they'll do is they'll put out these compilations and they'll put really shoddy sort of graphics on the cover. They'll have writing all over them. They'll basically reuse a photo from another album cover and they'll put a mixture of songs on them and they'll package them cheap and they'll sell them really cheap. And I call them truck stop tapes because a lot of times you'd see them at truck stops. So, you'd go in to pay for your gas and there'd be a little carousel, a cassette.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what you'd find there,
Yeah.
they might have a section that has new and current albums, but then they'll have this other one that has these cheaper tapes, and they'll either have like really old tapes or tapes that have been cut out, so they'll have the holes punched through them.
Uh-huh.
Or they'll have these truck stop tapes, which are, they'll say they're from 1987, but there's no songs from 1987 on them.
Yeah.
He's 10 years old. So the first thing I ever bought by Sammy Hagar solo was in the summer of '88, and I bought it because it's the only I had a certain amount of money left, and I think it might have been if it was at a store like a Kmart, I think. Um, I had a certain amount of money to spend, and the only thing that was in that price range, because I found a section that had all these 2.99 tapes, which was pretty cheap at the time. And I found this. It's called Red Hot. It's got a photo of Sammy jumping in the air. And it was put out by Capitol. And what I learned later is it's a combination of songs from the two live albums he did for Capitol, official live albums, is All Night Long, and then there's one called Live 1980. It's just a mishmash of songs from those. I didn't recognize any of the song titles on them except for one, which I'll get to. But I liked Sammy and Van Halen. I liked the solo songs I'd heard from him, which weren't too many. I'd heard like maybe five. So I bought it. And so that became the first early Sammy Hagar stuff that I got to hear. And it's actually not a bad first purchase because it's live. And like a lot of things in the 70s, the live versions of songs
Hmm.
are better. I mean, look no further than Kiss Alive, right? I mean, those are the definitive versions of those songs. Um, what that also had on it was a couple of songs called Space Station Number Five and Bad Motor Scooter, which I didn't know, but I came to find out later that Sammy was in this band called Montrose, and they're both from that debut album, which I bought the following year, and it's one of my favorite albums of all time, and it's usually considered to be a classic.
Hmm.
The other curious thing about this particular tape is that it had a song called "I've Done Everything for You," and I looked at that, and I mean, I'm a young guy, grew up listening to pop radio, and I go, "Well, that's a Rick Springfield song. What is Sammy Hagar?" I didn't know, for years I wouldn't know because there were no credits in it, nothing remotely resembling credits in it. And it wasn't until years later till I found out that Sammy Hagar wrote that song and originally recorded it, and it was Rick Springfield that covered it and had a hit with it.
Wow. Yeah.
Something else I talk about in the proper section of that book. But that's what got me started. But to find the actual albums where those songs came from, it, like I said, it took me a long time. But the truck stop tapes, they were just, it was like a phenomenon, but a quiet one. They would show up in stores that didn't even have a dedicated music section. You'd be in
Right.
the you'd be in the middle of this department store, and right in the
Yeah.
middle, dump bin full of them.
Or be in a drugstore, like at the counter
Exactly.
at the drug. When you said
Yeah.
that spinning
Yeah.
carousel thing,
Yeah.
that totally brought it
Sometimes
back.
you'd have to ask somebody to unlock the things. You
Yeah.
just can't
Yeah. It
take
was like a
them.
total weird thing. They'd be in the weirdest places, like the
Yeah.
supermarket or something
Yeah.
like that, you
Uh-huh.
know?
Oh yeah, and then when the CDs, CDs kind of took over from cassettes, be the same thing. Really cheap looking artwork on them, and
Yeah.
you'd recognize two songs, but not the rest of them. But they'd be really, really inexpensive. Truck stop tapes.
Yeah. Great stuff. All right, Tim. Like we talked about at the beginning here. I'm not really a big Sammy Hagar fan. I don't own any Sammy Hagar vinyl back there. So for somebody like me, give me the Sammy Hagar solo essential albums, first albums to get, and give me the ones that I should avoid unless I'm a hardcore fan and I'm collecting all of them. So essentials and avoid at the beginning.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say, don't yeah, instead of maybe avoid, like don't start with these ones.
Yeah.
You might be put off. Um, does a lot would a live album be cheating?
No, like I said, if somebody's, you're going to get your first Sammy Hagar record.
Okay. I'm gonna say that one of them should definitely be his first live album, which if you buy it in North America is called All Night Long. And if you bought it in the UK, it's called Loud and Clear. Same album, different artwork, different title, and the UK one has an extra song on it. But like I said, his early albums, especially his first three, were very, very conservatively produced. They were produced with AM radio in mind. So even if they did have the occasional heavy song, they didn't sound heavy. And he did have some really cool rockers in his early days, songs like Reckless and Don't Stop Me Now. And so I would definitely go with All Night Long / Loud and Clear. I think that's the best representation of his early years that you can find. The next one I would definitely get is Standing Hampton, which was his first album for Geffen. It was his first platinum album. It has a lot of songs on it that I think the average listener would recognize. For one thing, if they're into Sammy with Van Halen, they'll definitely know There's Only One Way to Rock because Sammy would do that with Van Halen many years. A lot of times they open shows with it. The Live Without a Net home video opens with that. It's the first time I ever heard it. I didn't know it was a Sammy solo song. I was just learning. It's also got I'll Fall in Love Again, which was his first song that almost broke the top 40. Um, it's got Heavy Metal on it, which was the title from the movie of the same name, like you said. Funny thing, if you listen to the Standing Hampton studio version and you listen to the soundtrack, they're two different recordings.
Oh, wow.
Two
Okay.
different, same song, two different versions. Um, so that's two. I would say Three Lock Box. Three Lock Box is my favorite Sammy Hagar solo album from 1982. It's the second Geffen one. It's really poppy in places, but I find if you're into listening to that sort of 80s radio rock with a little bit of a hard rock edge, I think it's a great album. I would stack it next to if you want to listen to Night Ranger or Foreigner or
Hmm.
Nova or stuff like that. Three Lock Box fits right in. It's got his biggest solo single, which was Your Love Is Driving Me Crazy. Oddly enough, I would definitely not recommend VOA, which is his biggest solo album, and it's the one that has Can't Drive 55 on it. Uh, I think that album is half of a very good album. That's just my opinion. Um, let's see, we got to move along here through the decades. I would say I'm trying to weigh it out because I'm kind of biased because it's my second favorite Sammy Hagar album, and I've loved it since it came out. But I'm going to go ahead and say 1997's Marching to Mars. That was his first album post Van Halen. I mean, as most people know, it was a bitter breakup, no matter what side of it you look at. And Sammy never ever wanted to leave Van Halen. He figured he would retire with this band, and he found himself out of the band. And I think it's one of his most personal albums. I think there are heavy songs on there. I think there's some really soulful songs on there, and um, some of his best lyrics. Sammy sometimes will take a lot of flack for his lyric writing because not all of it's exactly poetry. But I'd say Marching to Mars, and that leaves us with one more. Um, and you know what? I'm going to go with an album that he put out in the year 2000 called 1013. Um, and one of the fun things about doing this book is that obviously I had to know what I was talking about. So even though I've owned all of these albums, I went back and I did some serious listening to them because especially the latter day stuff, when you get older and you have other commitments, you have family, you have jobs. Sometimes I would buy his album because just out of loyalty, listen to it once and then file it. And that was kind of the case with some of them. And I went back and listened to 1013 and I forgot how really, really strong an album it is. Um, and I think that if you like his singing at all and you like hard rock, yeah, I don't see how you could not like 1013. So yeah, I would go with All Night Long, Standing Hampton, Three Lock Box, Marching to Mars, and 1013. If you don't like any of those, there's not much point of going any further.
Hmm.
As for the ones to avoid, this is the fun part. I would definitely avoid his first album, 9 on a 10 scale, because and I could really name any of his first three albums, which all came out in a very quick amount of time. So he put his first album out in 76. He put out two albums in 77. The second one is self-titled. Sometimes it's called the Red Album. And then there's Musical Chairs. And between those three albums, you could probably assemble one really good hard rock album. But there's so much filler and there's so much mellow stuff and yacht rock and R&B and just 50s style retro rock and just a lot of it's really, really, really hit and miss. So I wouldn't go for either of those three, but especially that first one, 9 on a 10 scale. Four out of the nine songs on that album aren't even there are covers. Like he does a Van Morrison song, he does a Donovan song. Very strange. So I would definitely avoid that one. Um, and you know what? I'll throw Musical Chairs in there too, because of the three of them, the Red Album is probably the strongest. Musical Chairs is just more of the same. I mean, it's got some great songs on it, like Reckless, Crack in the World's a really good song, but then it's got Try to Fall in Love, which is a really terrible ballad, really boring, and just some other songs that are just, they just kind of sit there and do nothing. So there's two. Then the next one I would definitely avoid if you were just getting started is 2006's Living It Up. This was when he went full on into his hard rock Jimmy Buffett, beach bum, sunglasses and shades, and strum an acoustic guitar, and let's get my favorite country singers in and
Yeah.
make a really, really mellow beachside album that does absolutely zip for me. I know people really like it, but for me, it's a chore to listen to. So that one. Um, and I would say by the same token, I wouldn't okay, hold that thought. I would also say the album he put out in 2008 called Cosmic Universal Fashion is a strange one because it starts off really well. It's got about four really strong songs, and then the quality just dips. And it's really weird for a lot of reasons. It was only out for a few months before Chickenfoot was a thing, before it was announced that he'd formed this group with Joe Satriani, Michael Anthony, and Chad Smith, and they actually put out a first album that was certified gold, which is pretty amazing
Mm.
for a bunch of old rock guys. But Cosmic Universal Fashion was just forgotten, and once you get past the first three or four songs, it loses steam really quick. So I definitely wouldn't put that on as a shining example of what Sammy can do. And then for a fifth one, not that I think it's that bad. I just think it's a little schizophrenic. In 2013, he put out an album called Sammy Hagar and Friends, which kind of is like Living It Up, only it's got a few more hard rock songs on it, but he's got a ton of guest stars. He's got Kid Rock on a song, whatever you think of him. He's got Ronnie Dunn from Brooks and Dunn on a song.
Yeah.
Uh, he covers Personal Jesus by Depeche Mode. Um, but it does have some good stuff on it. It's just not. I wouldn't start with it. I definitely wouldn't start with it, and it does have some more of that beach bum stuff on it too. So I wouldn't start with any of those five albums. But if you find yourself getting into it and you really want to get them all, that's why it's here. It's like this is what he
Yeah.
did. Take it or leave it. And like I said, I think you can get an idea from reading my review, whether you agree with my review. You can kind of tell. Well, this isn't exactly a headbanging album. This sounds like a heavier album for him. This doesn't sound like a rock album at all, that sort of thing. So that's asking me right now, I think those are pretty solid choices.
All right, great. Well, like Tim mentioned, if you're somebody like me that doesn't go deep at all with Sammy Hagar solo, this is the book for you. He goes through these albums, and it doesn't get, I also appreciate the fact that you move fairly quickly. I mean, it's like 3 or 4 pages on each record, 3 to 5 pages. So it doesn't get too bogged down with any kind of like this guy was in the band and this guy was in this band and that band and that, that kind of like thing. You get right to the music, you get right to what's going on there. So this is a really great book for those people out there. Even if you're a Sammy Hagar fan, if you're a big Sammy Hagar fan, you're going to love this book because it kind of puts it all in one place for you. So definitely check this out. Tim, where can people get the book?
This book and all of my books are available on Amazon wherever you live, whatever your country is, your home country's Amazon. They're all there.
What do you got on the plate for now that you finished this? What's your next project?
Got two books on the go, and I'm not ready to reveal who they're about, but they're both about bands. One is another panel book, and one's another one like this that's just me writing it. And that one's turning out to be more of a challenge, but I kind of welcome the challenge. So I'm working on those two things. Of course, I've had my channel, Tim's Vinyl Confessions, for over 10 years now, and that's going to keep going. And right now, as we're filming this, I'm in the midst of a deep dive through all of these Sammy Hagar solo albums, which is kind of a companion to the book when it came out. I did the same thing with Y&T in Kansas as well. So yeah, just enjoying it, man. I'm always inspired when people are starting their channels. I'm like, you can't have enough good content out there, right? So yeah, I'm gonna keep at it, and hopefully people continue to dig the books. I've been really blown away by the response to them. And the really cool thing this time around, I'm noticing that so people are buying the Hagar book, but they're also going back and buying my previous books. So I've said it many times, the big music geek that I am, I love the fact that I now have a back catalog. I think that's pretty cool for people oh, he's got other things too. So yeah. So just Amazon, type my name in, Tim Durling, and Red on Black. It should call it right up.
Awesome. And your other books too are still available on
Yep.
Amazon. Yep.
Mhm.
All right, that's awesome. All right, Tim. Well, thanks for joining me here at the Lair. We look forward to your future projects, and we look forward to having you back on here talking about whatever you got going on here in the future. So, all right, thanks again, and we'll see everybody out there. Make sure you check out the book, and we'll see everybody again.
Thanks, John. See everybody.